Well, we're not completely free. We're subject to the laws of physics and the laws of biology. Our bodies wear down. We need nutrition. We're vulnerable to all kinds of environmental insults. Our ability to behave depends on the structure of the brain that we're born with and the culture that we're embedded in. On the other hand, we're free, certainly free in the sense that one couldn't predict anyone's behavior down to the last choice, even knowing everything about his parentage and culture and individual history. And there's an enormous scope for the brain to craft new forms of behavior in response to the person's particular situation and perhaps in response to random factors that we don't understand. Well, certainly people can control their own behavior. That's what our big prefrontal cortex is for. We respond to incentives. That's why you generally get more peace and order when there's good government than in a state of anarchy. Why people do everything from not park in no parking zones if they think they'll get a ticket, to refrain from killing people that they're jealous about or angry at. We can control our behavior. We can seek to improve ourselves. We can learn more. We can apply mental discipline to avoid temptation, to refine our own ability to reason. On the other hand, not everyone can do everything. I don't have any illusions that with any amount of practice I could be as good a physicist as Richard Feynman or as good a basketball player as Michael Jordan. Part of wisdom is knowing what the scope is of your own room for improvement and discipline. It's equally foolish to think that nature and culture give you no options and to just be fatalistic about your prospects in life, or to imagine that you could do anything that you set your mind to. Part of the wisdom of being an adult is knowing what the fences are on both sides of the range in which you can improve or change yourself. I think mature people recognize that they have a certain temperament and a certain cognitive style. Some people are more lighthearted, others are more morose. Some people are apt to be conservative in their outlook, others looser. I think part of being a wise and mature individual is to recognize your own quirks and traits, to discount them when you're trying to arrive at an objective appraisal of events. Realize, well, I would think that, given that I'm by temperament conservative or by temperament an anarchist, and try to see reality objectively, subtracting out your own biases. When it comes to choices of how to live your life, then there are many areas in which you want to indulge your own temperament. You don't want to continually put yourself in situations that will just make you grumpy or anxious if there's no ulterior benefit to forcing yourself to do what you aren't otherwise inclined to do. We have every reason to believe that genes matter in terms of a person's temperament or outlook. Identical twins that were separated at birth, for example, who share all of their genes but not their environment, tend to be correlated in political attitudes. That is, to some extent, your tendency to be liberal or conservative seems to be affected by your genes. Degree of religiosity, not whether you'll believe in Jesus or Buddha or one God or many gods, but the extent to which spiritual experiences are an important part of your life and you're likely to engage in religious practice and belief. That has a heritable component. Intelligence has a heritable component. Personality, whether you're anxious or calm, open to experience or more timid, whether you're conscientious or more aggressive and irresponsible, all of those have some degree of susceptibility to influence from our genes. Now, in no case is the influence 100%. There are always differences, say, between identical twins, even brought up in the same home, who share both their genes and their environment, which suggests that there are influences on personality and temperament and intelligence that are not genetic and perhaps not cultural either. There may be idiosyncratic quirks that shape the development of the brain in utero or in the first few years of life that also go into what makes us what we are. But certainly the effect of the genes cannot be negated. By now we have many sources of evidence from studies of twins, from studies of adoptees, that show that genes probabilistically matter. People use the word human nature to refer to the characteristic ways of experiencing emotion, of having motives and drives, of categorizing and reasoning about the world that are common to all members of Homo sapiens. The fact that humans speak, the fact that we remember, often not very accurately, that we judge probabilities, also with systematic biases, that we fall in love, that we experience fear, and indeed fear of particular kinds of objects and experiences like heights, predatory animals, darkness, venomous snakes and spiders, social scrutiny. We get angry when we feel that someone else hasn't taken our welfare into account. We trust people. We feel grateful when they do us favors. We feel angry when favors are withheld from us. We feel sympathy to people in need. We categorize and label our experiences. We think that living things have an internal essence that gives them their form. We think that other people have minds that govern their behavior and their thoughts and feelings. We think that physical objects continue to exist when you don't look at them. Those are just some of the many psychological traits that collectively make up human nature. I think that understanding ourselves is a prerequisite to just about everything that's valuable in life, to enlightenment, to cooperation, to escape from the self-deception that mires us in conflict and argument. Chekhov once said, "Man will be better when you can show him what he is like." And as a psychologist, I think those are words to live by. And part of understanding what makes us tick is understanding the forces that organized us, that put us together, that gave us our design. And that means that ultimately we have to look to evolution as part of the solution to who we are. The human brain is a highly non-random piece of biological machinery. It doesn't learn to do everything equally easily. It does some things without having to learn anything. To understand why it works the way it does, we have to know something about the forces that shaped it. And that means an understanding of the ecological niche that our species evolved in, the strategies that our ancestors used to make a living in that environment, as a way to figure out why we're built the way we are. Educating someone enhances the cognitive tools that you need to determine what is true or false or sound or unsound. It consists of facts about how the world works and what happened in human history that are generally agreed upon. More importantly, it includes ability to think critically, to examine arguments, to recognize fallacies in reasoning, including the kind of fallacies that the human brain makes us vulnerable to make finer distinctions, to sharpen analyses. All of these are very different from indoctrination, where it's a matter of enforcing particular beliefs or ideologies on people as opposed to allowing them to test and verify them for themselves. Even when it comes to facts, scientific or historical facts, what an education should equip you to do is to understand how those facts could have been, were discovered, what could lead them to be falsified, and the ability to satisfy yourself that they really are facts as opposed to taking them on authority. In the case of science, it means understanding the experiments that led to a particular conclusion or field observations. In the case of mathematics, it's being able to retrace the proofs. In the case of history, it's being able to evaluate the physical and documentary evidence that led historians to come to some conclusion. Now, no one has enough time to track down every justification for every fact. If historians tell me that the Normans invaded England in 1066, I'm pretty much going to take their word for it. If scientists tell me that fossils are 550 million years old, I probably won't learn everything that I would really need to know in stratigraphy and dating and geology and so on to verify it for myself. But if I ever wanted to, I could. I would know what kinds of chains of reasoning led scientists or historians to their conclusion. And if I was skeptical about any one of them, I could check for myself. I believe that most historians and scientists and other scholars have established enough of a track record so that even for those claims that I don't bother to go out and check, I trust them, and generally that trust is repaid in the areas where I am skeptical. But the point of education and the point of scholarship is that there's ultimately nothing that has to be taken on faith. Anything that you take tentatively as a belief is simply because of the trust earned by the scholarly establishment as a whole, but individually any fact can be questioned and its basis in evidence examined. I think indoctrination takes advantage of certain traits of human nature that we would do well to identify and understand. One of them is self-serving biases. People like to believe things that put them or the group they belong to in a good light. Everyone thinks they're on the side of the angels. Realizing that you are apt to think better of yourself and your gender and your religion and nation than you ought to is the first step towards getting an objective assessment of what you and your group are like. There's reason to think that our self-serving biases and our self-deception may not be a bug as far as evolution was concerned, but a feature, something that it might pay to have for certain purposes. In particular, people are often in a situation in which they can get an advantage by distorting the truth in their direction, by portraying themselves as more honest, more trustworthy, wiser, more knowledgeable, more objective than we really are. Now, that will only make other people skeptical of our claims to wisdom and generosity. And the question is, how do you persuade other skeptics that you are as wise and generous as you are selling yourself as? Well, if there's a kind of arms race between deceivers and lie detectors, and if any twitch or inconsistency or a bit of nervousness can give you away, The most effective way of persuading a skeptic is to believe your own lies. The best salesman is the one who believes in the product. The best liar is the one who believes his own lies. Because if you believe that you are infinitely wise and patient and knowledgeable and generous sincerely, you're not lying, and therefore you can't give yourself away by your lies. The problem, of course, is that when everyone is built that way, there's apt to be human conflict and argument, where two opposing sides sincerely believe that they're in the right and that the other person is just impervious to argument or is self-serving. I think it's a source of great tragedy that we're apt to believe our own self-serving story, to sincerely believe that we are seeing the world as it is and that other people are deluded or dishonest or impervious to reason. And you can have two people sincerely believing opposing views about themselves and the other side. Evolution is descent with modification. The fact that organisms, a lineage of organisms will change over time. Natural selection is the most important mechanism of evolution. It's not the only one, because there are also random factors in evolution, but natural selection is the process that gives rise to the appearance of design, to eyes that see and wings that fly and arms that grasp, all the kinds of illusions of engineering that so impress us about living things. The way that natural selection works is that it's a process that is kicked off by replication. You've got to have some kind of system that can make a copy of itself, including the ability of the copies to make copies of themselves. When that happens, you'll have an exponential explosion in the number of descendants. No finite environment can support an exponentially growing number of gadgets. They'll inevitably compete for the raw materials to build the copies and for the energy to power the replication. Since no copying process is perfect, copying errors will inevitably crop up. If any of those errors, by chance, increases the rate of replication, it will, over a very small number of generations, crowd out its competitors. As that process is iterated over many generations of copying and occasional errors, the population will come to be predominated by replicators that look as if they've been engineered toward efficient replication, but in fact have simply accumulated all of the copying errors that made them more effective replicators. That process, when we see it backwards, when we look through the wrong end of the telescope and look back from the present, gives rise to what we see today as design, but which in fact was just differential replication of replicants with copying errors. I think there's a lot of reason to believe that the idea that there is a unified self, a single I that's in control of our entire minds, is something of an illusion. That there can be multiple selves that are operating simultaneously. There are some clever experiments that show that when people are distracted, they will often be more objective about their own generosity and ability than when they can set their mind to it, suggesting that that there is an unconscious thought process that has an accurate view of the self, but then there's a spin doctor or an advertising executive pushing that unconscious voice down so that its damaging insights don't leak out to the disadvantage of the entire person. And we know from neuroscience there are other ways in which there are multiple selves. The two cerebral hemispheres, to some extent, operate independently and shunt information back and forth across the corpus callosum. The cortex and some of the subcortical structures are each doing their own thing and talking to each other in the intact human. Different parts of the cortex are processing information in parallel. There are mechanisms that harmonize the different parts of the brain when we act. It's not as if the right leg wants to go in one direction and the left leg wants to go in another direction. Ultimately, they all have to be reconciled. But inside the skull, we have every reason to believe that there are many selves all thinking and wanting at the same time. I think any explanation of what makes us tick has to take place at several levels. We have to understand the flow of information in the mind, what representations of the visual world, of language, of emotions are active and how they exchange information. We have to know how it's all implemented in neural tissue, and we have to know the evolutionary forces that explain why the brain is the way it is, as opposed to some other way it could have been. There wasn't any cosmic engineer or designer who wired the brain up according to some explicit plan, but the process of evolution implicitly organized the brain to do some things better than others, and that explains why, say, of various intelligent devices that we're familiar with, computers and cameras and human brains are very good at doing certain things that computers are bad at, like recognizing faces or digesting the gist of a story or controlling arms and legs. And computers are good at doing things that brains are bad at, like multiplying 5-digit numbers. Evolution is the source of answers to the question of why the brain is good at some things and bad at other things. And I think the ultimate source of the answers to questions about why there are certain quirks, why there are certain biases, why there are certain desires that we have, desires for food and sex and safety and esteem and knowledge, that organize the brain to seek out certain goals and not others. Evolution is the ultimate source of those kinds of constraints on the operation of the brain. Oh, there's enormous room for improvement in the human condition. There are vast parts of the world that have only begun to tap the mechanisms of wealth creation that we've enjoyed in the West. Vast parts of the world that haven't begun to enjoy the levels of freedom that we've had in the West. And needless to say, there's lots of improvement that the West itself can and ought to do. There are, no one can reasonably predict what gifts technology can deliver to us in the future. And we desperately need technological advances that will generate energy more cleanly, that will grow food more efficiently, that will lengthen human lifespans. Just as 100 years ago, no one could have predicted some of the huge advances in well-being that we've enjoyed, I don't think that we can predict the potential for what our children and grandchildren might enjoy. And of course, we have the challenge not just of trying to make life better, but to prevent it from getting a lot worse, which of course could happen if we don't deal with problems like global climate change, energy shortages, new pandemics, increases in population, decreases in available water, and many challenges that, if we do nothing, will make the state of the world a lot worse.